In this news roundup of a week for Friday, October 17th, 2025, President Trump has arranged another meeting with Vladimir Putin, with Zelensky and European leaders again coming to the White House. After all the hubris and celebration of Trump as the saviour of the Middle East, it's starting to sink in just how hard the next period is going to be. Trump's America seems poised to do something in relation to Venezuela. We discuss the possible scenarios. Also, I do some updates on stories from earlier in the week. So, let's jump straight in. President Trump spoke again with Russia's Vladimir Putin by telephone this week, and this was just before he was due to meet today with Ukraine's President Zelensky at the White House. On one telling of a story, Trump is riding on the crest of a wave after supposedly bringing peace to the entire Middle East. And now there's just this one little tricky job for him to wind up on his way to that inevitable peace prize. Well, looking beyond the juvenilia, it is by no means clear what happens next. So let's start with yesterday's call. From Trump's telling, it began and was substantially about, yes, Vladimir Putin flattering Trump, in the way that everyone knows that you have to do these days. Bear in mind he'd already done some pre-flattery by saying that he felt that Trump should have won the Nobel Peace Prize this year because that's the minimum required sycophancy required. But obviously Putin is a master of his craft, so it went well beyond that. And Trump reported it this way: President Putin congratulated me and the United States on the great accomplishment of peace in the Middle East, something that he said has been dreamed of for centuries. Do we really think Putin thinks that's what's just been done? Well, of course not. If Putin is anything, he is a historian of empires and conflict. But yes, he knows that's what Trump believes, or at least how he is presenting it, so of course that's his take. President Putin thanked the First Lady Melania for her involvement with children. He was very appreciative and said that this will continue. That's a remarkable inversion. Melania Trump has been, to her credit, seeking to reunite Ukrainian children with their actual families, having been kidnapped by Putin's Russia, and in many cases brainwashed to hate their own country. Putin is presenting it as though she's doing a nice project to help unnamed orphans, a universally welcomed endeavour by the good-hearted Russian state. Because of course he is. In her presentation a week ago, the First Lady talked about being able to arrange the return of 8 children. MAGA folks online said this just showed how utterly overstated the problem had been, which I suppose is more comfortable to them than the reality, for the reported figure of 19,546 children have been taken by Russia, of whom just 1,605 have been returned. Plus 8. Obviously something of a sideshow. Trump then went on to say, we also spent a great deal of time talking about trade between Russia and the United States when the war with Ukraine is over. So yes, that's all the stuff Putin had on his list for establishing common ground with the president, getting him into a good frame of mind, none of which has anything to do with the actual substance. And then they decided they should meet again in a couple of weeks in person at Budapest in Hungary, which is conveniently leaving the International Criminal Court, so it won't have the duty to arrest Vladimir Putin as soon as he disembarks. Nothing substantive about the matter actually at hand was reported. Now, interestingly, today, the Financial Times published a more detailed account of what actually happened in the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska, along with a revelation that Trump nearly walks out as an early stage. Trump had arrived in Alaska expecting to do a deal with Putin. We saw all that pomp and circumstance at the start. We saw Trump applauding Putin for walking confidently off his plane. Fair enough, it seems to be a skill that eludes recent US presidents. And then, after a bit of fawning and praising, they went into the meeting room to get on with the business. And the FT said this: behind closed doors, the warmth quickly faded, according to multiple people briefed on the talks. With just a handful of advisers present, Putin rejected the US offer of sanctions relief for a ceasefire, insisting the war would end only if Ukraine capitulated and ceded more territory in the Donbass. Now, of course, that message should have been a surprise to precisely no one, because it was consistently what Putin has been saying. But you will recall that Trump's incompetent special envoy Steve Witkoff had spent 3 hours or more with Putin without even an independent translator to hand, and he had come back talking about having made a breakthrough on territory that completely changed everything. But by all accounts, save for those from Trump's own press office of course, he had misunderstood everything that Putin had told him. Well, having turned down the deal, Putin then delivered the sort of rambling historical monologue that he's become famous for, as demonstrated in his excruciating interview with Tucker Carlson some time ago. Weirdly, that didn't play well with Trump, who apparently raised his voice several times and at one point threatened to walk out. Now this fits the facts, because it was noted at the time that Trump's press secretary Caroline Leavitt and Steve Witkoff had come out of the room at one point, clearly looking somewhat shocked and stunned. And of course, a planned working lunch was cancelled. Trump and Putin did terse remarks. No questions were allowed from the journalists present. Trump, of course, couldn't publicly admit that his big summit had turned into something of a car crash. So, of course, he hailed it as a great and successful day, leading the Ukrainians and European leaders to fear that he'd somehow given the family silver away. They all then rushed to the White House to try to retrieve the situation, after which they all pronounced themselves greatly relieved without going into detail. But that, it seems, was why. It's also why Trump has upped the rhetoric against Russia, pretending that his punitive tariffs against India, for example, were to do with its buying of Russian oil. I mean, maybe that's true, but many close observers suggest that Modi's refusal to credit Trump with ending the flare-up between India and Pakistan, or to nominate him for that blessed Peace Prize, that really had a lot more to do with it. But even Trump, with his blasé public admission of things that other presidents would have kept quiet, didn't want to admit that. Arseniy Yatsenyuk, former Ukrainian Prime Minister, told the Financial Times this: Trump was really thinking that he can get a peace deal with Putin. The offer that was on the table for Putin was very good, but Putin overreached. Actually, Trump's deal was based on the misconceptions he'd been fed by Witkoff. So it was a miss, because at no point had Putin indicated he was prepared to go there. And now here we are again. Trump is still high on the fumes from all the fawning and celebration of him as the new Mahatma Gandhi for our times in the Middle East. May be tempted to believe his own public relations. So another call with Putin. A great call, of course. Another meeting today with Zelensky. No doubt it will be a great meeting. And another summit to come with Putin in Hungary. So what's changed? In Trump's mind, the threat that America may sell Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine, enabling it to hit Moscow and other targets within Russia, that is what has alarmed Putin and brought him back to the table. May be true, but it's likely to be a simplification. In any case, it doesn't presuppose what Putin's objectives in coming back to the table would actually be. Some, apparently including some in Ukraine, seem to have been influenced by the thickly layered sentiment in Israel to believe that maybe a similar breakthrough could happen here. By all accounts, Putin seems to understand that the Alaska summit between him and Trump did not go as well as he'd hoped. But at the same time, with all the flattery he's been layering on, there's nothing to indicate that his mission won't simply be to persuade Trump not to sell the Tomahawks, not to push secondary sanctions against countries buying his oil. Putin still seems convinced that defeating Ukraine on his own terms is the ticket to him taking his place amongst the great leaders of Russia. Giving that up in order to become a non-player character in the game of Trump doesn't seem to be his highest ambition. I know, shocking. And right now, Trump has refused to put direct sanctions onto Russia, certainly not placing secondary sanctions on all the buyers of Russian oil, since that includes China, where he's struggling not to lose outright to them. So while Putin may be mistaken in believing himself to be the obvious long-term victor of the Ukraine war, Russia's economy is after all showing some signs of strain. That's the sort of thing that could continue looking strong until one day it doesn't. So while he may be mistaken about that, he obviously still believes it. It's hard to see Trump shaking that. Of course, maybe Putin will have been taking careful notes on the Middle East. Maybe he will be concluding that if he can get into Trump's hands a several-stage plan, the first stage of which is mostly symbolic, and then agree specifically to that first stage, that will be enough for Trump to get his parade, to claim to have solved the war. Last week I said we would get lots of hubris, plus of course the bit that really mattered, the return of the hostages. And then the difficult part would still be left to do. And goodness me, did we have a lot of that hubris. Industrial scale hubris. Trump went to Israel, of course, for his victory lap. First, the Knesset Speaker, Amir Ohana, went on and on and on about how Trump was a colossus who will be enshrined in the pantheon of history. And then a long speech from Benjamin Netanyahu, also layering it on very thickly, praising Trump for his pivotal leadership, calling him the greatest friend the state of Israel has ever had in the White House, and putting Trump up as the first non-Israeli nominee for the Israel Prize, along with the inevitable name check of the Nobel Peace Prize that he surely deserved. Followed by Trump's own typically too long and too rambling speech where he declared he had, quote, achieved peace for all eternity and the historic dawn of a new Middle East. On social media, you had people who really should know better, caught up in all the hubris, saying things like, don't all those people who have never given Trump credit for anything have to apologise now? Sure. If you really believe that out of the goodness of his heart and for the love of peace, he brought eternal peace to the Middle East. Let's reflect instead that back in 1993, when President Bill Clinton oversaw the signing of the Oslo Accords between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, many of the same things were said. The accords were seen as the beginning of a lasting settlement. Rabin, Shimon Peres and Arafat got a Nobel Peace Prize. Not Bill Clinton, notice. Clinton got due credit for the constructive role he played, but nobody felt the need to tell him over and over and over again how wonderful he was, how he was the President of Peace. He did a competent job on one of the sorts of things that the leader of a free world might seek to do. In those hallowed, more adult days, that was worthy of recognition, just not the sort of rank obsequious stupidity that we've seen much of the world reduced to in recent days. Obviously, the Oslo Accords did not result in everlasting peace. There's no particular reason to believe that's where we are today either, at least not without a great deal more focus and effort. That focus and effort is somewhat undermined by the charade where it has been declared that peace in our time has been achieved, done, sorted. Not, we've made a good start, finally gotten the hostages home, thank goodness, all due credit to those who helped to make that happen. But now the hard work begins. Because for one thing, in spite of what Trump occasionally says, Hamas does not believe it has agreed to disarm. It doesn't seem keen to do so. As soon as the Israeli forces withdrew from the part of Gaza that they were occupying, Hamas fighters moved in to reassert their control, executing some of their rivals for power that they feel they needed to get rid of. Trump has said, well, if Hamas doesn't agree to disarm, then we'll go in and disarm them. By which he doesn't mean America, of course, he means Israel, which sounds like an admission that another misunderstanding of what has or hasn't been agreed to could very quickly lead to a resumption of the war. Then you have a plan for a board of peace to oversee Gaza's reconstruction. The tricky dynamics of a multinational force seeking to provide security alongside Hamas, who are seeking to retain their grip. Bearing in mind, Hamas has done well in recruiting new people to replace many of those who have been killed, because bombing a population and killing tens of thousands of civilians will inevitably lead to the radicalisation of a significant proportion of the survivors. Add to that the fact that things will remain difficult for the population in the early months to come, stretching to years. The thankfulness for fighting is over will very quickly turn to anger. That anger will very easily become directed at a multinational body that has no local legitimacy at its command. Are those unsolvable obstacles? Maybe they are, although maybe not. They still seem unlikely to be solved by an administration that has already declared victory, and whose head has famously short attention spans and has an inability to grasp detail. Now, of course, that's why they talk about Tony Blair and Jared Kushner, and people who, love them or loathe them, at least have some understanding and some competence to their name. But it remains an enormous challenge. All those ridiculous people chanting that Trump is the president of peace, blah, 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 blah. They are playing out juvenile US meme swapping at a time when real leadership and skill is actually needed, pretending that Trump is motivated by wanting to bring peace to the world rather than to achieve goals of his own that would benefit from the end of that conflict, which would be fine. That's actually normal. I mean, normal when it doesn't involve astonishing amounts of corrupt enrichment in terms of relationships with the Gulf states. But obviously focusing on those details is sour grapes because, you know. Meanwhile, the president of peace has to decide whether he wants to invade Venezuela and depose its leader by force. This week, we heard Trump say that he had agreed to covert CIA operations in Venezuela. Now, you might think that the announcement of operations in public would, by definition, sabotage the covert part of that sentence. What remains unknown, though, is the nature of those operations and their purpose. Since the US sent a naval fleet into its waters, started blowing up boats, allegedly with drug runners inside, the speculation has been lively as to what the actual purpose is. Trump had speculated during his first term as president, as related in his book by John Bolton, who has had a bad week of his own this week, whether he should have taken out Maduro. He was talked out of doing that then by adults who are no longer in the room now. Venezuelans opposed to President Maduro heard the news last week, happy for them. Devastating for Trump, of course, that the opposition leader Maria Corina Machado had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Trump wasn't pleased, but he was kind of placated because Machado quickly made sure to go online and do all the necessary bowing and scraping in his direction to try to prevent him from turning against her. Nicolas Maduro also wasn't pleased. Venezuela has announced that it's closing its embassy in Norway in protest. It certainly added some sense of hope and momentum to the opposition's cause, since the previous election was widely seen to have been won by them but denied by Maduro. The question is, what is Trump going to do about it? Not only did he admit the CIA involvement, but Trump has also said that his administration was considering striking targets on land inside Venezuela next. Strikingly, the military leader in charge of the US fleet that has been taking out those various boats, he stood down this week. One might speculate that's the sort of thing a leader might do if they were told to carry out orders that they considered to be illegal or illegitimate. Well, it could be something else, so nothing conclusive comes from it, but it's a notable event as the operation is clearly shifting gear. You can see this going a number of ways. The least likely is that the US out and out invades Venezuela, tracks down Maduro and removes him. The force that the US has amassed is significant, arguably not sufficient for that task. It also doesn't really fit Trump's profile. He's happy to send a special mission to hit someone, to take out a military installation, so long as it seems containable and not likely to escalate into a fight with someone who can hit back. Venezuela has competent forces, particularly it has air defences, so it doesn't sound like the sort of sure thing that would appeal to Trump. That could instead turn into an operation of some sort to do a surgical strike against Maduro personally, something that's clearly occurred to Maduro. You could see them encouraging the local opposition to rise up in rebellion, with the US providing information and tactical support. It's possible. Seems unlikely to succeed given how much time Maduro has spent brutally getting rid of that opposition. Or you could see Trump ramping up the pressure and then cutting a deal with Maduro. Now that would be a very Trumpy thing to do, and of course a major disappointment to the opposition. In 2020, in Trump's first term, the administration put forward a transition deal, which suggested a roadmap for a move towards a point where democratic elections would be restored. That will only appeal to Maduro if he feels his position is so weak that what is being offered is preferable to the rather brutal outcomes that often await dictators if their reign comes to a sudden end. Right now, it's by no means clear that's how he feels. So we wait to see what action that complex spaghetti turns into. Something seems to be in the air, possibly sufficient to get leaders of good moral standing to refuse to be part of it. And not just in the field, a bipartisan group in the Senate is planning to force a vote on legislation to bar Trump from launching hostilities within Venezuela without explicit authorization by Congress. Trump, of course, would be able to veto such a measure, even in the unlikely scenario that enough GOP members were going to vote for it. We will find out what's really planned in due course. In the meantime, the US seems committed to keep on blowing up boats and killing their occupants in exactly the way that Nobel Peace Prize winners don't. Alright, a couple of quick updates from stories covered earlier this week. Yesterday, I talked about the International Maritime Organization vote on the world's first global carbon taxing system. The US had failed to persuade other countries not to back them in voting down the move. However, the vote, when it took place today in London, gave some ground to the US by deciding to postpone introducing the system by 1 year. That was the fallback position of the US, which will aim to use the extra time to ramp up the pressure on all the various countries to successfully scupper the plan when it comes around again. Obviously, the people promoting the scheme will also be fighting that every step of the way. It is, however, an undoubted setback. I talked also about the turmoil of French politics last week. It turned out that President Macron went back to his Prime Minister, the one who had just resigned, Sébastien Lecornu, and persuaded him to give it another go. You'll recall that I explained that a large part of the controversy was the attempt to get France to agree to a balanced budget, with that controversy already fired up when Macron, back in 2023, brought in an increase to the retirement age from 62 to 64, while Lecornu just survived a confidence motion. And the prize for achieving that was to put off for 2 years any idea of getting that balanced budget and reversing the increase in the retirement age as well, for now. Kicking the can down the road, in other words, in the manner favoured by politicians faced by difficult decisions through time immemorial. What, we ask ourselves, could possibly go wrong? Alright, I had one bit of sort of exciting news this week. YouTube has finally, a number of months after the event, recognised and conceded that this channel has passed the threshold of 100,000 subscribers, which means I will finally get one of those silver plaque things that, let's face it, I've been craving about as much as Trump has been craving that Nobel Prize. It seems that after a long period where the channel was static at 20-something thousand subs, for it to then suddenly shoot up by over 100,000 kind of made them suspicious. I must have, bought the services of large numbers of bots or something. So it was put aside for special investigation, and I guess they finally got around to doing that and found, nope, all above board. Now also, one comment from a viewer, David Noakes, who said this: Mallen, your analysis is brilliant. Shucks, thank you. But could you not insert the odd kitten and rainbow? It's all getting a bit much. Interesting times, I guess. Personally, I listen to news and current affairs much less these days because honestly, I feel helpless. I'm retreating into 70s crime drama. Now, I sympathise with the sentiment. I think the key thing to remember is that as we go into times of more conflict and organised chaos, it will slowly become a new normal. In so doing, it will just look a lot like history has often done in previous times, and people got used to that as the backdrop to their lives. Having a lower degree of certainty, they develop greater resilience in the face of it. Remember, we can't control what happens in the world, sure, but we can make ourselves stronger and better able to deal with what it throws at us. We are in control of that. However, that said, in the spirit of your requests, no, I don't have kittens, I don't have rainbows, but I have had in my head for the last week that when Trump promotes himself as the President of Peace, I keep hearing it in the voice of a seal, playing at being Marvel's Wolverine. To see what I mean, this is the clip from the BBC.
I'm Wolverine! Ah! I'm Sabretooth! Wolverine! Ah! Sabretooth! Wolverine! Sabretooth! Wolverine! Sabretooth! You can't get me on Wolverine! I'm Sabretooth!
Pack it in, you know I'm working nights.
Ah, the old BBC. How we miss you. My thanks as always to the patron supporters of this channel, without whom I could not make these videos. That's all for now. Have a great weekend.